Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Cimmerian September. This is a BookTube event created by Michael K. Vaughan, of course, designed to celebrate Robert E. Howard's immortal creation, Conan the Barbarian, by sinking ourselves into Conan stuff and Conaniana all month long. It's an event just designed for Hannah at Hannah's Books to enjoy. uh, And the informal theme, of course, you read anything Conan related for September, you're fine. You're in like Flynn with Cimmerian September. But the informal theme of Cimmerian September this time around is pastiche fiction. More specifically, the pastiche fiction that dare not speak its name. The pastiche novels that were more than pastiche novels, that were done by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter and Bjorn Nyborg, right at the beginning of Conan coming to the public consciousness at all, unless you were an old-time reader of weird tales. The repackaging of Conan for a broader mass-market audience happened under the hands of L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter, who took Robert E. Howard's original stories and, yes, loving them, reprinted them, but changed them, altered them, took some Robert E. Howard stories that weren't Conan stories and made them Conan stories, changed the Conan stories that existed, imposed a chronological time scale on the whole thing, which Howard did not do, and just in general mucked about with things, sometimes rather perniciously on a line-by-line level, so that you as a reader, I mean, we gobbled these things up. When they originally came out in the 70s, we gobbled these books up. And they really created a fan base for Conan, I think. As much as anything did before the Schwarzenegger movie, I think they created Conan's first big, broad suit. His first broad fan base was those books, those mass-market paperbacks. No matter what hipsters tell you about limited edition hardcovers or anything like that, hipsters are largely objects of mockery, specifically because they were the original gaslighters. No, this was really popular then. No, this was really great in then. No, I was around for the whole phenomenon. I really think that this is the case. And although that's a positive, that you're introducing the world of Hyboria and Robert E. Howard and Conan to all of these people who are just hungry for sword and sorcery fantasy and didn't know it, it's also horrifying because there's no reverence to the original text at all. I think it's largely understandable. L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter would probably say now, if we could ask them, and certainly L. Sprague de Camp did say in many essays and interviews that he gave, that he was honoring Howard by doing this. Surely what a writer wants is the largest readership possible. So I'm honoring him by doing this. I'm nipping and tucking here and there. Who thinks that that a story that Howard bashed out on a manual typewriter in no time at all and sent to Weird Tales, who thinks that's sacrosanct? It's just a pulp story. Of course I can go in and muck around with it on a line-by-line basis. Of course I can. I'm going to fix some errors. And while I'm at it, I might as well fix some other things. We might look at that now, 100 years removed almost from the original appearance of these stories, and think that's sacrilege. But I don't know that. I think there's a case to be made that it wasn't. But we're concentrating on those Conan books. I'm sure that you're familiar with them. That most of them have great Frank Frazetta covers. That L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter really produced alongside Robert E. Howard. Maybe Howard knew that his stories weren't perfect. He knew that people, before he killed himself, he was aware that people were mucking around with things a bit, or wanted to. If it wasn't L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter, it might have been Glenn Lord or a couple of other literary friends. Like I said in an earlier video, I think he would have been one of the first people to change his original Weird Tales stories. I feel absolutely certain of that. And maybe, heretical thought, maybe he would also have agreed with imposing a chronological time frame on Conan, even though that wasn't his original idea for the character. But I've been reading a lot of Conan pastiche novels so far. September is only 3 days old, but I've been subsuming myself in it. And I read one last night. It was a reread. I haven't read it in probably 2 decades. That really shows the perils of blurring the line of authorship the way L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter and Bjorn Nyberg did. Because they took all of those Robert E. Howard stories and smoothed them out, retitled some of them, reworked some of them, fit some of them into a chronology that they were largely inventing, changed some of the lines, bawdlerized some of the racist or sexist language, so that the books, the series of books that you were getting that we're mainly talking about here, were really a conglomerate production of Robert E. Howard and all these other writers. And then in 1978, we got this, Conan the Swordsman, where you've got this fold-out poster here for this paperback, and this is a bunch of, notice what the cover says: never before published adventures. What does that imply? That implies never before published Robert E. Howard Conan stories, but it, of course, is not. And the L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter don't try to pretend that it is inside the book. This is just a collection of their stories of Conan, with a long appendix about Hyborian names that's rather interesting. But this is stories: the Legions of the Dead, People of the Summit, Shadows in the Dark, The Star of Kerala, The Gem in the Tower, The Ivory Goddess, and Moon of Blood. Just Conan stories, that each one of which has a grounding paragraph in italics at the beginning telling you where this is happening in Conan's life, what adventure he's just coming off, what adventure he has yet to have, where is this in Conan's tapestry of adventures. And I reread this last night, and Moon of Blood, the final story, is, I think, the best one. But boy, there are problems with these stories. And it automatically makes me think of something that actually a video by Grammaticus Burks earlier today also made me think about, which is, what is pastiche fiction? And how do we judge when it's done well? I think that's fascinating. Just a fascinating subject. I love that on a whole bunch of different IPs, a whole bunch of different intellectual properties. I think that's fascinating. And also in a whole bunch of different genres, a whole bunch of different media. I've watched probably far more than is good for me Star Trek stuff, productions, on YouTube. And you could argue that those aren't pastiches in the same sense of the word, because there's no official body of literature for Star Trek, or there wasn't when they were made. But you certainly couldn't say that with Conan. And I've watched a lot of Conan fan fiction, Conan fan movies. And also Lord of the Rings. Unlike Conan, Lord of the Rings is zealously guarded. You cannot do pastiche fiction on Lord of the Rings. They'll take you to court and they'll win. They'll squash you. They'll bury you in court fees. It's a zealously guarded copyright. Unless it can be bought outright and desecrated by Amazon, it's a zealously guarded copyright. And yet, fan films abound. And they are awful. Just awful. They're just unspeakably awful. Most of them, although almost all the ones that I've seen on YouTube, are awful. They're amateurish. They're usually appended with a disclaimer saying, please don't sue us. This is done out of love. We're not intending to make any money off this, etc., etc. And you get that right down the line. There are pastiche productions all over the place on YouTube of pretty much any literary product. Somebody has tried it at one point or other. And they're awful, and they're not just awful because of bad production quality. You could forgive that. They're most of them are awful because they don't get it. They don't get the original. What does that mean? What does that mean, to get the original? I've been dealing with pastiche fiction for my whole life. Around the time that Conan pastiche novels were exploding, also Star Trek novels were exploding, and it might not be the same kind of pastiche, but the same question applies. I would open a new Star Trek novel, Covenant of the Crown or whatever, and I would say, do you get the original? I'm willing to have you be a substandard writer, but do you get the original? What does that mean? What does that even mean? And will that be the same for every fan, or will it be different? And here, I don't know. It seems weird and scandalous. It seems utterly unbelievable to say that Bjorn Nyberg and Lynn Carter, and especially L. Sprague de Camp, don't get Robert E. Howard's Conan. How could they, of all people, not get this character? And yet, Conan almost never seems like himself in these stories. Almost never. And I'm not talking about the weird Prince Valiant archaisms that are all through these stories, like yonder or forsooth. Conan the Barbarian says forsooth in almost every story in this book, which is... I'm not talking about that because there's a lot more of that kind of Prince Valiant stuff in Robert E. Howard's Conan stories than people tend to remember. I think because most people have their ideas of Conan the Barbarian formed by either the movie with Schwarzenegger or, equally likely, the 20 years of Conan stories that were written by Roy Thomas. One writer telling the stories of this character for a long time, far longer than Robert E. Howard told them, in huge detail. And I think I'd be willing to go to the mattresses on this point. I think that Roy Thomas got Conan the character better than anybody. I might say better than Robert E. Howard, but certainly equal to Robert E. Howard, and better than any other pastiche writer. And if you're reading those issues, well, that might form your perception of the character. If that's true, you're not going to encounter that character much in these stories at all. I don't know quite what to make of that. So that I was reading these things and I was enjoying them. I've read lots of L. Sprague de Camp. I've read lots of Lynn Carter. I almost always like it. It reminded me, reading this book, I was talking about it now, I'm remembering what Grammaticus Book says in his latest video about the original Schwarzenegger Conan movie, that it isn't a good Conan movie, but it is a good fantasy movie. And these are good fantasy stories. But do we want to sacrifice that difference when we're coming to Conan? Surely we come to a Conan story for Conan. And I didn't encounter that much here. This Conan makes puns and witty wordplay. He thinks himself clever. He practically titters at his clever wordplay. He's not particularly violent, except when roused to it. He's not particularly basic, except when forced to be. I mean, there are interesting confrontations with wizards in a couple of these stories. One of the stories has an interesting little thing happen that I often wondered, reading the original Conan stories and reading all the pastiche novels. I often wondered, I mean, Conan he's an incredible swordsman, a native kind of swordsman, never taught by a professional, and he's incredibly strong and incredibly durable and stoic, so he can put up with a lot. We are led to believe by Robert E. Howard that this is a trait largely shared with other Cimmerians. We just don't see them. But I've always thought when I read Conan Adventures that he's also lucky. He's just incredibly lucky. How many times does he go to some city, hidden or otherwise, that's stalked with plague, and it doesn't affect him? People did die of disease, and disease doesn't care how strong you are. Lots of people died of plague, and he doesn't. Lots of people shot through full of arrows like a pincushion. He's never done. He can take an arrow in a leg or a shoulder now and then, but he's not filled full of arrows, which a lot of really strong, doughty warriors were. And you just die if that happens. Also, he never falls and breaks a leg. He never breaks an arm. He's never just thrown in a dungeon and forgot about it. He's thrown into dungeons, but he works his way out of them. When plenty of strong, able warriors were thrown into dungeons and just forgot about it. Okay, I have captured you and your band of warriors on the road. I'm certainly not going to feed you. I'm not going to take the bother of guarding you all the way back to Aquilonia. So what we're going to do is we're going to find a well, a stone-lined well, really deep stone-lined well. We're going to throw you all down it. So you're falling 50 feet. You're landing on each other. You're breaking bones. You're becoming a mass of damaged, injured people at the bottom of this well. We're going to take up the rope of the well and put a stone over the top. And that's it. You're going to writhe around down there. Some of you landed on your head. Some of you landed on each other. Some of you broken legs and arms. You don't have any food or water. You can't climb the walls, and you can't get out. Anyway, you couldn't lift the stone with no leverage, so I'm gonna put a stone on top of this well that needs 6 people to lift. So no one person inside that well can move it. And that's it. I'm going to do that. It's going to do the work of a fun afternoon. I'm just going to ride on and leave you and forget about you. Well, Conan faces that kind of defeat dozens, if not hundreds of times in his adventures. No one ever does that to him. The famous example from the Conan movie is when he's crucified and manages somehow to just live through it. But, and you could say, of course, right alongside Monty Python's The Life of Brian, you could say that is unlucky. It's a slow, horrible death. but it always struck me that doesn't happen to Conan more often. That he's also lucky. He manages to stay hale and healthy and stronger than anybody all the way until he seizes the crown of Aquilonia. When random chance could easily have worked against that. And in one of the stories in this collection of stories, something that would have happened thousands of times does happen to him. He's bitten by a viper. Well, okay, there's nothing heroic about that, but that is going to kill you. Unless you're immune to cytotoxins, that is going to kill you painfully, humiliatingly. Actually, so would dysentery. Conan never gets that either. But he's bitten by a viper. He hacks its head off, throws the body across the tent, shakes the head and the fangs loose, and then had that old chestnut from the old pulp magazines and from old Western novels. He uses his knife to cut an incision on the point of entry on the fang marks and suck out the venom. That doesn't actually work. That doesn't actually work. It's just a silly thing. I don't actually know where it came from, except maybe people thinking that you can get rid of this stuff just the way it came in. In the scene where Conan does it in this book, his arm is already going black, so the poison is already spread. I don't know why he's just sitting there sucking and spitting the venom when it's obviously in his body. But apart from that silly scene, surely that would have happened to Conan many, many times, that he would be bitten by a snake. He's in their environments all the time. But no, half the semi-magical allure of Conan is that he is proof against anything in the natural world. Just like he's proof against anything in the supernatural world. So when he encounters a lion, well, or a giant grizzly bear, oh, okay, when you were a teenager, you broke a bull's back in Cimmerian. But a man armed with a sword is going to lose against a grizzly bear, much less the prehistoric 20-foot-tall grizzly bears of the Hyborian age. A man without a sword is certainly going to lose against a grizzly bear, a tiger, a panther. Conan can beat these things. He can beat these creatures, even unarmed. I know you just have to accept that. That's part of the allure. But I was interested. It was interesting to see that, and on a couple of other occasions, Conan in these stories has feet of clay. We see a little bit more of what it'd be like for him to be in the real world, even though this isn't the real world. But even though DeCamp is very punctilious about aping a lot of the vocal mannerisms and the plot superstructures from the Robert E. Howard stories that he loved. Let's keep in mind, he was Robert E. Howard's biggest fan. Even though he does that very scrupulously, not a lot of this felt like Conan. And that makes me wonder, what are we talking about when we talk about pastiche? That is just a fascinating thing for me. I've read every Conan pastiche novel, some of them many times. I plan to reread a lot of them this month. But always I am asking, do they get Conan? Do pastiche fiction get the original? And how many sins are you willing to forgive if it does? So tell me all. Tell me all about it. But that's my report for Cimmerian September today, is Conan the Swordsman, which I read for the first time in forever. And I did enjoy it. I just don't know that I was reading about Conan a lot of the time. And I wonder what that means. And I wonder if another Conan fan could pick up this book and think, oh, that's spot on. I've seen it happen. So anyway, that's my report for today. I'll be back to bore you with more Conan stuff tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.